Hey everybody, welcome to week 6 of Jazz History. Hopefully everybody's done the midterm at this point. The next unit we're focusing on is bebop and cool jazz. And it's interesting because, we give names, or someone gives a name to these subgenres. And in the case of bebop, what I came to understand was that there is a song written by Dizzy Gillespie, one of the great trumpet players of bebop, and the song is called Bebop. You might know this tune. So that's part of that song. But when asked what, whoever was talking to him at the point said, "What was that?" And he said, "Bebop," which meant the title of the song. And so whoever he was talking to thought that was what the music was called. So that name stuck with what the music was called. So when we talk about important figures in jazz, hopefully some of you have heard of Charlie Parker, and one of the most important musicians in jazz. Like many of the important jazz musicians, and of course some of the lesser figures, did not have a very long life or a long career, but in his short life was able to change the language of jazz in a way that has stayed within the jazz canon, or the way that we play jazz even today. His influence has been lasting. So so there's a lot of information in the PowerPoint and in the Ken Burns, of course. But I think the important thing to know about Charlie Parker's approach is that, and you could say the cool school. Well, getting back to what I was saying about giving the name to the music. So the name bebop, in a way, describes the sound of the music, and came from Dizzy Gillespie's song. But when we talk about cool jazz, that was definitely something that a name that came from the critics. Miles Davis did not call his music cool jazz. Chet Baker did not call his music cool jazz. So that's important to remember, is that in some way you could say that all of the cool music, and even when we get into hard bop, that it's still bebop in a way, just with slightly different salient characteristics. So it's not really that much different in terms of the harmonic and melodic language. It's just presented in a somewhat different way. But even so, the idea of the bebop vocabulary, and in some ways, when people use the term post-bop, that there are some post-bop music that retains the elements of bebop. In fact, sometimes when I've done this unit, we play some free jazz, Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry, and some of the students have had a hard time being able to distinguish between bebop, hard bop, cool jazz, free jazz, and so-called post-bop, or whatever you want to call it. So, which is why I prefer to think in terms of names rather than styles or subgenres, even though in some ways the subgenres make it easier for people to understand how to group things together. I suppose I'm contradicting myself because I've organized all of the PowerPoints into subgenres. However, the fact that I have my top 10 beboppers and my top 10 cool jazz musicians and so forth, hopefully gives the idea that the individuals are really important in this music. So Charlie Parker, from Kansas City originally, which was a hotbed of music. In some ways it was kind of the Vegas of its day, was known as the city of vice, so a lot of gambling and a lot of other trouble that you could get into. And so for all of these activities, they needed live music. So in some ways it rivaled New Orleans for the amount of music that was happening. And Charlie Parker apparently did not show much promise musically as a young child, but at a certain point, in some ways this legend has been overblown, but apparently he went to a jam session as a young player and only knew 2 songs, or perhaps only knew 1 song, and so they called. They called Body and Soul, and he only knew Honeysuckle Rose, so he played basically the wrong song. And the legend is that Joe Jones threw a cymbal at his head, and this is the legend that everyone uses to say, look, Charlie Parker was so embarrassed by his failings at a jam session that he practiced 18 hours a day for a number of years and developed a new concept. And in fact, there is a movie that I think is worth checking out called Bird. It's from the 90s, and it was directed by Clint Eastwood. And, just for getting a general sense of Charlie Parker's life, it's okay. But the Ken Burns is fine. So anyway, the main thing technically is that the linear vocabulary, when we say linear, we mean lines, like melody lines. So if we have a melody like Cole Porter's, what is this thing called, Love? When we say linear, the line, the melodic line, the melody, those are all kind of interchangeable. But now the improvisation takes on a whole new virtuosity and a whole new idea. So the way it's described is that Charlie Parker realized that any of the 12 tones of the chromatic scale can be used to resolve a melodic line and be used to make melodic lines. So sometimes it's also described as when they say, what did Charlie Parker discover? What was he hearing in his head? They say that he was hearing the upper color tones of the chord. And you could think about it that way too. If you have a 7th chord and you have the upper notes, or even a simpler chord, maybe, or a dominant chord. So he's taking more advanced harmony and using it melodically in a way that had never been done before. Now, when we listen to Coleman Hawkins' version of Body and Soul, where he basically abandons the melody after a mere measure or two, and we start to see how important the improvisation is becoming. That was, in some ways, the beginning of bebop, the idea that the solo is important and the new melodic line is more important. So, as opposed to somebody like Louis Armstrong, who in some ways, his improvisation was more based on varying the melody and sort of using more melodic, more of the original melody to make new melodies. Now, the original melody is considered not even important. In fact, one great development of the bebop era was something called the contrafact, which is mentioned in your PowerPoint, and a contrafact is a new melody over existing chords. And there's two reasons that bebop musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, even Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell, the list goes on, but used contrafacts was one, I believe it was a way for them to develop their sense of this new melody and to make the melody into a new song. So it was a creative endeavor, but also the fact in music publishing, if you cover a song, you owe the composer royalties. Chord changes themselves cannot be copywritten or used in that way. So, as they say, if that were true, whoever wrote the blues changes would be a billionaire. The chords of songs like I Got Rhythm and What Is This Thing Called Love and Blues Changes and many other tunes, you could write a new melody and it was called a contrafact. So again, we've heard What Is This Thing Called Love. Here is a contrafact. Actually, this is played, and I think I used this example in the PowerPoint. It's played often by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. It's called Hot House. It's actually written by a great pianist named Tad Dameron, who is more known as a composer, maybe not quite a virtuoso pianist, but certainly known as a composer of the era. So here's his contrafact on What Is This Thing Called Love. So, one thing you could do when you listen to the recorded version of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, it's on a TV show playing the songs, you could sing What Is This Thing Called Love along with the song and see how long you can stay with the chords. It's a little hard to hear, but so in this case, this new melody becomes a new catalyst for improvisation. And of course, back in those days, the 1940s, the 1950s, Cole Porter's music was more new than it is now. So it's more likely that people were very familiar with these melodies and possibly very familiar with these chords. One thing I like to talk about with bebop and cool jazz, and really any of these movements or subgenres, is that, to me, I see them as a reaction to what was happening at the time. So the swing era was still going on at this point. So the music started to change. It was really a jam session music, sort of like what musicians pursued after hours. Many of these musicians, in fact, Charlie Parker was working with Cab Calloway, but he was working with big bands, you know, so after they would be done with their big band gig, they would go to a jam session. And 52nd Street in New York had many of these clubs where musicians would jam all night, you know, and this is where the music started to flourish. Unfortunately, a lot of it was not recorded, and some of this is due to the recording ban of 1942 and 44, which had to do with a dispute between musicians and the American Federation of Musicians. And that was also part of the reason the swing era ended, was that recording ban. But so during this time, you know, Charlie Parker was experimenting and musicians were starting to play this way. But one of the reasons that they started to become more insistent on this new style was because it was so different from the swing era style. Although there are still common elements, the swing rhythm and certain forms and certain types of tunes and blues, of course, but in some ways, particularly when we talk about black musicians, they were thinking that once again the swing era flourished because we talked about Benny Goodman's performance at the Palomar Ballroom. Once again, sort of white society embraced the music when white musicians played it. And so Thelonious Monk is described as saying, well, we wanted to create a music that white people couldn't play. It was too hard for them to play. And of course, it didn't turn out that way, but that was it was in some ways a conscious effort to create a sort of a private language, if you will, something that maybe they didn't want people to understand. And it did have a cult following, but I think it's obvious that this kind of complex music would not have the same broad reach as Benny Goodman's music or Tommy Dorsey's music. This was very complicated stuff, and especially when you consider the fast tempos, that were occurring during the bebop era. So there's tons of stuff in the PowerPoint to check out. Talking about cool jazz. So cool jazz, we talk about Miles Davis, who was kind of a protege of Charlie Parker, and we consider him to be important in the bebop era, but at a certain point he decided to go in a different direction, and we look at a record called The Birth of the Cool. That was not the title that Miles Davis gave this music, and he was not thinking in terms of, I'm going to create a style, but he had the idea that he wanted to have a band with arrangements. And I think also when we talk about a reaction, in some ways some of the cool jazz, quote-unquote cool jazz musicians were reacting to how bebop really took hold of the community. But I think for some, there were some elements of bebop that they wanted to change. We talk about pianist Lenny Tristano and saxophonist Lee Konitz. Lee Konitz in particular was one of the first alto players back in those days to say, okay, I understand what Charlie Parker's doing, but I'm going to do it my own way. So he has a very distinct style. As an example, I wanted to play Lee Konitz's contrafact on What Is This Thing Called Love. So this is, in a way, it's a contrafact on a contrafact, but just to give you an example of some of the aesthetic of the cool school. So some of it, in a way, was, you could say, softer around the edges, maybe not as aggressive as bebop. But also in terms of the linear development, they took it to the next level in terms of intellectualism and abstraction. So, and in terms of having sort of this private language that they could only understand, like the idea of someone being hip. I don't know how much people use that word these days, but when we say hip, it's like being in the know. So, are you hip to this? This person is hip because they're into some music that no one knows about or that not very many people know about. So the cool school was sort of going to the next level in terms of hipness. So again, here's another contrafact on What Is This Thing Called Love, and this is Subconsciously. believe it or not, that is the melody of that song, and the improviser is supposed to go even further. So some of you may be asking yourselves, how can that be the melody? That sounds like an improvisation. Well, this was the aesthetic at the time, and jazz goes in yet another direction with hard bop, and hard bop is kind of a reaction to that hyper-intellectualism, is sort of getting back into the roots of jazz and hopefully trying to reconnect with the audience. So at this point, the idea is almost not trying to scare away the audience, but sort of, and getting back to one thing, talking about black musicians who, they wanted to go away from the sort of entertainer aspect of the music. Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, although in some ways Dizzy Gillespie is a little bit of a contradiction, but Charlie Parker was very serious about what he did, and was very influenced by classical music. Stravinsky was his favorite composer, and I think he was at one point trying to connect with Stravinsky and maybe get some composition lessons. But they wanted to be thought of as intellectuals, not as entertainers, not as sort of, clowns, if you will. So they took this very seriously, and obviously didn't sit well with, people who wanted to just come out and dance. In fact, many of the clubs that featured bebop music would put up signs that would say "no dancing." So it's very interesting to see where jazz is going. This may be the most challenging portion for some of you, if you can hang on at this point. I found that many of the novices with this music sort of get turned off at this point, but the point of this class is to give it a chance, and hopefully some of my explanations will help you appreciate it more. And, again, hopefully you're enjoying the class, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.